The Duke turned at the altar to face the woman he was about to marry, and instead his eyes found a face in the third pew that stopped his hand halfway to the ring. Cecily Crane stood radiant beside him in white silk, while 300 guests held their breath, and not one of them understood why the Duke of Rexford had gone the color of old ash. Imogen Crane had promised herself she would not move. She had practiced the stillness for a week in front of the cracked glass in the room she had been given at the back of the house, the room that faced the stables and got no morning sun. She had told herself she would sit in the third pew with her gloved hands folded and her chin level and her breathing even, and she would watch her younger sister become a duchess, and she would feel nothing the guests could read on her face. She had not counted on him looking up. Everard Locke, Duke of Rexford, had stood at the front of St. Aldwyn's with his back straight and his jaw set. A tall man in dark blue and antique gold. And he hadn't looked at the doors when Cecily entered on their uncle's arm. He had looked at the floor, as a man looks at the floor when he has decided something and is determined not to feel it. The bishop had begun. The words had moved through the cold stone air, old words, the same ones spoken over every marriage in that church for 200 years. And then, between one sentence and the next, the Duke had lifted his head and looked out across the crowd. Not at Cecily, past her, to the third pew, to the woman in gray who had made herself small, and his eyes had stopped there, as though they had struck a wall. Imogen felt it land on her like cold water down the spine. For 3 years she had been certain he had forgotten her face. She had built her quiet on that certainty. Now his gray eyes were on her. And they were not soft, and they were not pleading. They were a question, and under the question was something that looked, to her horror, like the slow gathering of a storm. "Your Grace," the bishop said, "if you would give your hand." The Duke did not give his hand. Cecily turned her head, the smallest movement, her smile faltering at the edges. She followed his gaze across the pews and found her sister sitting where the family had placed her, in gray in the back third, the poor relation, the one who arranged the flowers and counted the linens and did not dance. Cecily's smile did not fall. It hardened. "Everard," Cecily said softly, "just for him. The bishop is waiting." But the Duke had set down the question in his eyes and picked up another thing entirely, and Imogen watched his face change as a sky changes before the first crack of thunder. She knew that face. She had been the only one ever allowed to see it, on a terrace 3 summers gone, before everything that came after. He turned from his bride. A sound went through the church. Not a gasp. Something quieter and worse. The rustle of 300 people leaning forward at once. The bishop's book stayed open in his hands. Cecily's bouquet of white roses trembled. The Duke of Rexford walked 3 steps down from the altar toward the pews, toward the gray, and stopped. "Get up," he said. He did not say it to Cecily. Imogen did not move. She could not have said her own name in that moment. Their great-aunt Honoria, 2 seats down, hissed at her without turning her head, as she had hissed at Imogen for 3 years. "Sit still, you wretched girl. Do not make a scene of yourself." But the scene was already made, and Imogen had not made it. The Duke's gaze had not left her. 3 years ago," he said, and his voice carried, because the church was built to carry the smallest whisper to the back wall. "I was told a thing. I was told it by a person I trusted. I have built everything since on its being true." He drew a breath that shook only slightly. "And I have just understood, looking at your face, that it was a lie." Behind Imogen, near the door, a woman began quietly to weep, the way strangers weep at weddings, not knowing yet that this one had already broken. Imogen's hands had gone to ice inside her gloves. She thought of the letter against her ribs, sealed with gray wax, never opened, never sent. He cannot know about it, she thought. And then, with a falling sensation, that perhaps he did not need to. Perhaps her face had told him the part the letter held. If you have ever loved someone the world decided was not meant for you, and held it quiet, because saying it aloud would only have made the losing worse, then you already understand the kind of story this channel keeps, and you might think about staying, because the overlooked one, the woman in gray, the whole room dismissed, is the only sort of love I follow here to the end. Subscribe and walk the rest of this with me, because what Imogen Crane did with that silence is the part I have been waiting to tell you. To understand what the Duke saw in the third pew, you have to go back 3 years to a summer when Imogen Crane was not yet the poor relation, only the elder of 2 sisters in a house that had money then, before her father's death emptied it. She had met Everard Locke in a garden that was not hers. It was the garden of a great house she had been brought to as a companion to her cousin, a position that meant she was neither guest nor servant, but moved between the two like a draught no one could place. She had gone out alone at dusk to be away from the music. He had been standing under a stone arch with his coat off, holding a horse that had thrown its rider and would let no groom near it. And he had been talking to the animal in a low voice, steady, the kind of voice that gentles a frightened thing without seeming to try. She had stopped at the edge of the lawn and watched. The horse had pressed its great head against his chest. The man had looked up and caught her watching, and hadn't been embarrassed, only curious, as though a person who watched, instead of chattering, were a rare and interesting kind of bird. "You're very quiet," he had said. "I find quiet keeps me out of trouble," she had answered. "A pity," he had said. "Trouble is the only thing in this place worth a damn." That had been the whole of it the first night. A man, a horse, 2 sentences. But she had gone back to the music, with her heart beating in an unfamiliar rhythm, and could not make it stop for the rest of that summer. The house was called Ferrers, and it kept its visitors busy from morning to midnight, so that a person could pass a whole week there and never once be alone with their own thoughts. Imogen learned its hours the way servants learn a house. She knew when the gentlemen rode out and when the ladies took the air and when the long gap fell between the music ending and the late supper, when the gardens emptied and a woman who was no one to anyone could walk the gravel paths without a single eye following her. He learned the same hours. Neither of them ever said so, but on the second evening she found him under the same stone arch, and on the third and by the end of the first week, it was understood between them without a word that dusk near the stables belonged to the 2 of them, and that whatever was said there did not travel back inside. He told her things he told no one, that his father had died, hating him, for reasons the old man had never troubled to name, that the dukedom sat on his shoulders like a wet coat he could not take off, that he had been bred for the title the way a hound is bred for the hunt and had never once been asked whether he wanted it. He told her about the North, the cold gray house he would inherit and did not love, the tenants who depended on a man they had never seen smile. She told him things too, smaller things, that she liked the smell of rain on warm stone, that she had taught herself Latin from her father's books after his eyes failed, and he could no longer read them himself, that she was afraid, more than she was afraid of anything, of becoming the kind of woman who folds linens in someone else's house and is grateful for the folding. "You won't," he had said the seventh evening with a certainty that frightened her. "Oh, I won't let you." She had laughed at him because it was easier than believing him. "You are a duke. I am a companion who arranges flowers. You cannot let or not let me anything." "Watch me," he had said. And he had not been laughing. The horse, the same chestnut from the first night, had grown so used to her by then that it came to the fence when it heard her step on the gravel. Everard noticed it before she did. He noticed most things before other people did, she had learned, and said almost none of them aloud. "He likes you," the Duke said the night the horse came to her. "He doesn't like anyone. He threw 3 grooms and a viscount. But he likes you. Animals are never wrong about people. They haven't the cleverness to be fooled." It was the closest thing to a declaration he had made, and they both knew it, and neither of them said anything more about it. And the horse breathed warm against her glove in the blue dark. On the last evening of that summer, he asked her a question under the stone arch, with the chestnut asleep behind them. He asked her to wait for him. He was to go north for the autumn, to settle his father's estate, a matter of months. When he returned, he said he would speak to her uncle. He would speak to the whole grinning, gossiping world. He took her hand, and he was not cold then, not the way the Tun called him cold. He was warm and young and entirely hers, and he asked her to wait. She had said yes. She had written it down that same night, everything she could not say aloud, with her heart pounding so. She had written him a letter, 4 pages, and sealed it with gray wax, meaning to give it to him before he rode north, a thing he could carry and open on the road, a promise he could hold in his pocket. She never gave it to him, because the next morning her uncle had called her into the cold study and told her that the Duke of Rexford had asked formally, through his man of business, for the hand of a daughter of the House of Crane. And Imogen's heart had risen up so fast it hurt, and then her uncle had said the name. Not Imogen, Cecily, the younger sister. 17 then, golden, the family's hope. The one with the dowry their father had set aside before he died, the dowry that hadn't yet been spent paying the family's debts, because no one dared touch Cecily's portion. "You will be glad for your sister," her uncle had said. It was not a request. Imogen had stood in the cold study with the sealed letter against her ribs and understood that she had misread everything. That a man under a stone arch at dusk says things he does not mean to a companion who is no one. That she had been a summer's amusement, and Cecily was the match. She had thanked her uncle in a voice that did not shake, because she had already begun to learn the stillness she would practice for 3 years. She had gone upstairs. She had not opened the letter because to open it would be to read her own foolishness in her own hand, and she could not bear it. So she had kept it, sealed. 3 years, against her ribs. Through every house, the family moved her between as their fortunes shrank, and her usefulness as unpaid hands grew. Here is what Imogen did not know, sitting in the 3rd pew while the Duke came down the altar steps toward her. She did not know that Everard Locke had ridden north that autumn and written to her every week for 2 months. She did not know that not one of those letters had reached her, because they had been addressed to Miss Crane, the elder, and intercepted in the cold study by a great-aunt, who had decided the family's whole fortune lay with the younger girl in the larger dowry, and that a man who married Cecily could be made to settle the family's debts in a way a man who married penniless Imogen never would. She did not know that when no answer came, the Duke had written one last letter, a short and terrible one, asking only whether he had imagined the whole of that summer, and that the answer he finally received in a hand he believed to be hers had told him in 7 cold lines that Miss Imogen Crane was already engaged to another, that she had never taken his attentions as more than a diversion, and that he should not write again. She did not know that he had believed it, that he had stood at a window in the gray north and felt something in him close like a door against a draught, and had ridden south a colder man than the one who had gone up. She did not know that when the family had offered him Cecily instead, with her dowry and her 17 years and her golden hair, he had said yes the way a man says yes to anything once he has stopped expecting to be happy. He had not loved Cecily, he had not pretended to. He had told himself, a duke marries for the title's sake, and that warmth was a thing for other men, and he had very nearly gone through with it. She did not know any of it. She only knew that she had loved a man who had chosen her sister, and that the loving had not had the decency to stop, not in 3 years of folding other people's linens and arranging other people's flowers and saying yes ma'am and no ma'am to a great-aunt who watched her the way a jailer watches a door. And the cruelest part, the part she had never said to a living soul, was that she did not even blame him. She had decided early in that cold study that the fault was hers, for being foolish enough to believe a duke had meant it. It is easier to survive a thing you can lay at your own feet than a thing that was done to you by people you must still pass the salt to at supper. So she had carried the blame along with the letter against her ribs and called it her own, never once suspecting it belonged to someone else entirely. There had been a single moment a year into it when she had almost burned the letter. She had stood at the kitchen fire in a house in Bath with the 4 sealed pages in her hand and the heat on her face, and she had told herself that a sensible woman would let the past go to ash and be warm for an evening. She had held it to the flame, and she had not been able to do it, and she had hated herself for the weakness, and she had folded it back against her ribs and gone on. She did not know why she kept it. She told herself it was only that she could not bear to destroy a thing she could not bear to read. Those 3 years had a shape, if you stood far enough back to see it. After her father died, and the money proved to be mostly debt, the family had closed ranks around the one asset they had left, which was Cecily, and Imogen had become the thing that made the keeping of Cecily possible. She was the one who packed the trunks when a house grew too dear and a smaller one had to be found. She was the one who knew which tradesmen would wait another month for their money and which would not, and how to ask the waiting ones so they did not feel the asking. She arranged the flowers because flowers cost nothing if you knew where the hedgerows were. She mended the good dresses so they passed for new in candlelight. She did the work of 3 servants and was thanked about as often as weather is thanked, which is to say not at all, and noticed only when it turned bad. The great-aunt had set the terms of it without ever once saying them outright. Imogen was to be useful and silent and grateful, and in exchange she would have a roof, a back room, and the family's name to stand behind, which was worth less every year. It was still a name. There was a particular look Honoria gave her across a room, a flick of the eyes from Imogen to whatever needed doing, and Imogen had learned to read it, as a soldier reads a flag. She had told herself in the long evenings that this was simply what had become of her, the way a river becomes a marsh when the land goes flat, slowly, without any single moment you could point to and call the end of the river. She had stopped expecting to be chosen for anything. That was the part that had cost her most, though she would not have known to say so. A person can survive a great deal of folding and counting and mending. What wears them thin is the slow forgetting that they were ever anything else, until the version of themselves that a duke had once stood under a stone arch and asked to wait begins to feel like a story they had read once about someone else in a book they had since lost. And then a wedding invitation had come, addressed to the whole family, and the great-aunt had decreed that, of course, Imogen would attend because it would look strange if she did not, and Imogen had said, "Yes, ma'am," and had begun, that very night, to practice the stillness. The Duke stood now at the end of the third pew. Up close she could see what 3 years had done to him. The cold the ton praised him for was real now, set into the lines around his eyes and the set of his mouth. But under it, in this moment, something old was breaking through, and she watched him fight it and lose. "Look at me," he said. She looked at him. There was nothing else left to do. And whatever he saw in her face, in the wreck of her composure, in the way her gray eyes filled and did not spill, told him the rest of the thing he had begun to suspect the moment he looked up from the bishop's words. His own face changed again. And this time it was not the gathering storm. It was the worst thing she had ever seen on a human face. It was a man understanding all at once the full shape of 3 years lost. "You wrote to me," he said, very low. Only for her, she had not. The letters had gone the other way, his to her, and she had never seen them. But she had wanted to write to him so badly that she had a sealed proof of it against her ribs, and so she could not deny it, and the not denying was its own confession, and he saw that too. "No," he said, answering some question of his own. "No, you didn't. Someone made sure you couldn't." He turned then, slowly, and looked back up the church, past the frozen bishop, past his bride, to the front pew where the family of Crane sat in their best clothes, to the great-aunt, to the uncle. "Someone in this church," the Duke said, and now his voice did carry all the way to the back wall and out the open doors into the churchyard. "Wrote to me 3 years ago in a hand they meant me to take for hers. And I believed it because I was a young fool who thought a thing that good could be lost so easily. I have been paying for that belief every day since." The silence in St. Aldwyn's was complete. A bird had gotten into the rafters at some point, and they all heard it move now, a small dry flutter in the high stone, very loud in the quiet. Cecily had not moved from the altar. She stood alone at the front of her own wedding, the bouquet shaking in her hands, and on her face was an expression Imogen had never seen there before, because Cecily had never before been in a room where she was not the answer to the question being asked. She looked suddenly very young and very frightened. She looked at the great-aunt. The great-aunt would not look back at her. And in that one exchange, Imogen understood that her sister had known, not all of it, but enough. Cecily had known there had been letters and a misunderstanding, and had let it stand, because the misunderstanding made her a duchess. "Everard," Cecily said. Her voice cracked on his name. "Everard, please. The whole of London is watching." "Yes," the Duke said without turning around. "Let them." The bishop made a small sound, a clergyman's cough, the sound a man makes when a sacrament is sliding out from under him, and he has not yet decided whether to reach for it. The organist, who had been waiting in the loft for his cue and had long since lost the thread of what was happening below, played 3 uncertain notes and stopped. Somewhere in the middle pews, a child asked its mother in a clear, high voice why the man would not give the lady the ring, and was hushed, and the question hung in the stone air, because it was, in fact, the only question that mattered, and no one in the church could answer it but the man at the end of the 3rd pew. This was the moment, Imogen would think later, when everything could still have gone another way. He could have remembered his honor, his word, the 300 guests, the bride at the altar with her ruined mourning. He was a duke. Dukes did not stop weddings. The cost of stopping this one would be paid for a generation in drawing rooms and clubs, and the cuts of women who would never receive whichever Crane sister he chose. And she saw him weigh it, standing there at the end of her pew, the most powerful man in the county, deciding whether to set fire to his own life in front of everyone he knew. She did the only thing she had left. She stood, and she put her gloved hand flat against his chest, where she had once watched a frightened horse press its head, and she said so quietly only he could hear it, "Don't. You have a duty. I am no one. Let me go and marry her, and let us both pretend this never happened." And the Duke of Rexford looked down at the small gray woman with her hand on his chest, telling him to ruin her by leaving, and something in his face finished breaking. And what came up through the break was not the storm and not the grief. It was the boy under the stone arch who had talked a frightened horse into trusting him. "You are not no one," he said. "You were never no one. They only needed you to believe it because it was cheaper for them than the truth." Then he reached up and closed his hand over hers, the one pressed against his chest, and he did not let go. For a moment neither of them moved, and the whole church held that moment with them. 300 people who had come to watch a golden girl marry a cold duke found themselves instead watching a man in dark blue hold the hand of a woman in gray, as though she were the only solid thing in a tilting room, and a strange feeling moved through the pews. The feeling people get when a thing they had been told was settled turns out to have been wrong all along, and they realize they were part of the telling. Some of them had cut Imogen at parties. Some had let her arrange their flowers and tip her nothing. They sat very still now and watched, and began, a few of them, to do the arithmetic of their own small cruelties. Imogen kept her hand where it was and made herself breathe. She was aware, dimly, of how this would look written down, how it would be told and retold until it bore very little resemblance to the cold, frightening, exhausting truth of standing at the end of a pew with 3 years of practiced smallness coming apart in her chest. She did not feel like the heroine of anything. She felt like a woman who had been holding her breath for a very long time and had just been told, against all evidence, that she was allowed to let it out. It was the great-aunt who broke it. Honoria Crane had ruled the family for 30 years, through the simple expedient of never once allowing her own face to betray her, and she had carried that face into St. Aldwyn's expecting to leave it the great aunt of a duchess. But she had not expected the Duke to stand at the end of the third pew, holding her grandniece's hand in front of 300 people, and her composure, which was the only weapon she had ever owned, finally failed her. "You will not," she said, rising from the front pew, her voice shaking with 30 years of unquestioned command. "You will not shame this family in the house of God. That girl is a companion, a poor relation, a nobody. You are contracted to her sister, and the settlement is signed and witnessed." "Madam," said the Duke, and he did turn now, and the whole church saw his face, "I have spent 3 years a stranger to my own happiness on the strength of a single letter. I should like very much to see the hand it was written in. Will you produce it? Or shall I send my man to my carriage for my copy, here now before all these witnesses, and we will lay the two side by side and see whose pen made them?" He let the offer sit in the cold air. He was a careful man, and he had not made it idly. His man of business had kept that last cruel letter for 3 years in a locked drawer, as such men keep everything, and the Duke had read it perhaps 100 times, trying to find the lie in it and finding only Imogen's name signed at the bottom in a hand he had wanted to believe was hers. He had brought it south with him, without quite admitting to himself why. Now he knew why. He had come to his own wedding, carrying the evidence of someone else's crime, a stone in his coat he had carried for years, without remembering he had put it there, until the day he needed to set it down on a table in front of everyone. The whole church understood what he was offering, all at once. 2 letters, 1 room, 2 pens. There is no argument that survives that. A signature either matches or it does not. And a great aunt who had written one of them knew, better than anyone in that church, which way the comparison would fall. Honoria Crane opened her mouth and nothing came out. 300 guests watched the most feared woman in the county stand at the front of a wedding with her mouth open and no words behind it. It was not a humiliation the Duke had arranged. He had offered her a single question, a fair one in a level voice, and the silence she answered it with was entirely her own making. She sat back down slowly, her hands finding the pew rail as though the floor had tilted. She seemed, all at once, to be a very old woman in a good dress, and the power she had held over a frightened girl for 3 years simply went out of her in front of everyone like a lamp running dry of oil. Imogen did not feel triumph. She had expected to, in the long years of imagining a moment like this one and despising herself for imagining it. Instead, she felt only a vast tiredness, and under it, rising slow and steady, a thing she had not let herself feel in 3 years, which was relief. The bishop, who had married 4 generations of the county and seen a great deal of what people do to one another in the name of family, closed his book with great gentleness. "Your Grace," he said, "I think perhaps this is a matter best continued elsewhere. There are a great many people here, and not all of them friends." It was Cecily who surprised them all. She came down from the altar slowly in her white silk, and she stopped in front of her sister, and the 2 of them looked at each other across a distance that was 3 years and a great aunt and a dowry wide. Cecily's chin trembled, and she said, in a voice the whole church could hear because she did not try to hide it, "I knew there had been letters. I did not know what was in them. I told myself it did not matter." She looked down at her hands, at the white roses she still held, without seeming to know she held them. I told myself you would not have suited him, and that I would. That a duchess needs polish and you only had quiet. A tear went down her face and she let it fall. I have known for a year that I was wrong. I let it stand because I wanted to be a duchess, more than I wanted to be your sister. That is the whole of it, and it is an ugly thing to say aloud. And I am saying it aloud because you spent 3 years saying nothing, and one of us owes the truth a hearing. It was not a complete repentance. There is rarely such a thing in life, whatever the storybooks promise. But it was honest, and it was spoken aloud in front of everyone who had ever helped the family keep Imogen small. And Imogen reached out and took her sister's trembling hand, the way you take the hand of someone you have not forgiven yet, but might in time, if time is gentle and you both work at it. Go home, Cecily, she said gently. Not to the great aunts. To our father's house, what's left of it. We'll talk when there are fewer people watching, and no bishop, and no 300 guests deciding what our faces mean. Cecily nodded and wept, and was led out by an aunt through the side door, and the 300 guests parted for her, and to their credit no one laughed, because there is nothing to laugh at in watching a girl learn the cost of a thing too late, and most of them had a cost of their own, put away somewhere, that they did not care to think about. That left Imogen and the Duke standing in the slowly emptying church, while the guests filed out into the bright churchyard to talk of nothing else for a year. He had still not let go of her hand. There was a letter, she said. The words came out before she had decided to say them. 3 years of silence, and now she could not seem to stop. I wrote you one. The night you asked me to wait. I never gave it to you. I was going to give it to you before you rode north, and then my uncle told me the name, and it was not my name, and I thought you had never meant any of it, she breathed. I kept it, I don't know why. I never opened it, I couldn't bear to read what a fool I had been. The Duke went very still. You kept it 3 years, he said, sealed. Sealed, she said, it is against my ribs now. I could not seem to put it down. He looked at her for a long moment, and then, in the middle of the wrecked wedding, with the bishop discreetly examining the high stone ceiling and the last guests filing out into the churchyard, the Duke of Rexford did something no one in the county had ever seen him do. He smiled. Not the cold, half-smile the portraitists had spent 10 years trying to capture and never quite managing. A real one that took 10 years off his face and put the boy from the garden back into it. I have a box, he said, in the north, of letters I wrote you and never sent. After the ones I sent never brought any answer but the cruel one. I kept them sealed too. I told myself the same thing you told yourself, that I could not bear to read what a fool I had been to believe in a single summer. He shook his head slowly, marveling. We've been keeping the same letter for 3 years, you and I, in 2 different houses, in 2 different counties, each of us certain it was the record of our own foolishness. He breathed, and the breath shook. Imogen, it was never foolish. It was only stolen. She'd carried that sealed letter against her ribs through 3 years of folding other people's linens, and she had believed every day of those 3 years that it was the proof of how stupid she had been to trust a man above her station. Now a man was telling her, in a church that still smelled of the wedding wax and the bruised white roses, that the letter had never been proof of her foolishness. It had been proof of her heart, and someone had simply made sure it never arrived. She did not weep. She had wept enough for 3 years quietly into pillows in cold back rooms. She breathed instead, and the breath went all the way down steady. The first, fully steady breath she had taken since she was a girl, under a stone arch with a sleeping horse behind her. The county talked of nothing else for a season, of course. The Duke of Rexford had stopped his own wedding at the altar to the younger Crane sister and taken up, in front of all of London, with the elder, the poor relation, the companion in grey. It was a scandal of the first order, and it was repeated in every drawing room, from Mayfair to the sea, growing a fresh detail at each telling. The great-aunt retired to her house in the country within the month, and was not seen in society again. And if anyone asked after the letter she had once written in another woman's hand, no one answered, because the Duke, having proved his single point, never spoke of it in public again. A man who has won does not need to keep winning. He had what he wanted. The rest was only weather, and weather passes. Imogen did not spend that season triumphant. She spent it quietly, at the small house that had been her father's, mending the long quarrel with her sister an hour at a time, the way you mend anything that matters, with patience and no audience. Cecily came every week. They did not speak of the Duke. They spoke of their father, whom they had both loved, and of the years before the money went. And slowly the thing between them stopped being a wound and started being only a scar, which is the most you can ask of some wounds. Imogen and Everard were married the following spring, quietly, in a small church with 30 people instead of 300. And the only flowers were the ones Imogen arranged herself, because she had always been good at it, and saw no reason to let a stranger do a thing she loved. The chestnut horse, grown old now, was brought down from the north for no reason anyone could defend except that the Duke wished it there, and it stood at the churchyard wall and pressed its grey muzzle into Imogen's glove while the bells rang, and Everard watched the two of them and said nothing, and his face was not cold at all. On the morning of that wedding, in the room they would share, he gave her a box. Inside were the letters he had written and never sent, 24 of them still sealed, the wax gone dark with age. And she gave him hers, the 4 pages she had carried against her ribs for 3 years, the gray wax unbroken, soft now from the warmth of her body. "Shall we?" he said, his thumb on the brittle seal of the topmost one. "No," she said, and she was smiling. "Let's not. We know what they say. They say the same thing, so to all of them, yours and mine. I would rather keep them sealed and live the part we missed than spend our first morning reading about the years we lost." So they put both into the box together, sealed, the letter she never sent and the letters he never sent, and they closed the lid, and they did not open it that day, nor for many days after. Years later, when they were old, and the dukedom had passed to a son who had been asked more than once whether he wanted it before it was ever laid on him, Imogen would take the box down from the shelf on quiet evenings and hold it in her lap and not open it. The wax had gone brittle and gray with age. Everard would watch her from his chair by the fire, and he would not ask, because he knew. "One day," he would say. "One day," she would agree, and put it back on the shelf. They never did open it. Some letters do their whole work without ever being read. The gray wax held what they had been too afraid to say when they were young, and they had said it all in the years since, in plainer words than any frightened girl or grieving man ever found on paper, so that the letters became not a wound but a keepsake, the quiet record of a love that 2 thieves and a single forged letter had failed in the end to steal. On the last evening anyone would think to write down, Imogen sat by the window with the box in her lap, and the light going gold and then gray across the stone sill. The stables were quiet below in the blue dark. Their son was somewhere in the house with his own children, and you could hear them faintly, like water. The Duke, no longer young, no longer cold, sat across from her, and the fire settled in the grate, and outside the first stars came up over the dark line of the hills. She ran her thumb across the brittle gray wax, the way she had run it across the same seal in the third pew of St. Aldwyn's, a girl in gray who believed she was no one, in a church full of people who needed her to keep believing it. You were never no one, he had told her at the worst moment in front of everyone when telling her so cost him his whole arranged life. She had believed him eventually. It had taken a while. Belief like that takes a while. When you have practiced the other thing for years, until it is the only language you are fluent in. She set the box back on the shelf, beside the window, where the last gray light could just reach it. Some things stay sealed not because there is nothing inside, but because the 2 people who would read them already know every word by heart, and some loves are not rescued at all, only finally allowed to arrive 3 years late, at an altar in gray. Would you have stood and let him marry your sister, the way she very nearly did, telling yourself you were no one because everyone you trusted had told you so? Or would you have let your face be seen in the crowd and let the truth do what truth does, no matter what it broke on its way out into the light?